The divine law which governs the family has likewise on its side differences within itself whose interrelationships constitute the living process of its actuality. But among the three relationships of husband and wife, parents and children, brothers and sisters, the relationship of husband and wife is in the first place the one in which consciousness immediately recognizes itself in another, and in which there is knowledge of this mutual recognition. Because this self-recognition is a natural and not an ethical one, it is only a representation, an image of spirit, not actually spirit itself. A representation or image, however, has its actual existence in something other than itself. This relationship, therefore, has its actual existence not in itself, but in the child, an other, whose coming into existence is the relationship, and is also that in which the relationship itself gradually passes away. And this alternation of successive generations has its enduring basis in the nation. The dutiful reverence of husband and wife towards each other is thus mixed with a natural relation and with feeling, and the return into self of the relationship does not take place within the relationship itself. Similarly, with the second relationship, the dutiful reverence of parents and children towards one another. That of parents towards their children is emotionally affected by the fact that the objective reality of the relationship does not exist in them, but in the children, and by their witnessing the development in the children of an independent existence, which they are unable to take back again. The independent existence of the children remains an alien reality, a reality all its own. That of children towards parents is emotionally affected, conversely, by the fact that they derive their existence from or have their essential being in what is other than themselves and passes away, and by their attaining independence and a self-consciousness of their own only by being separated from their source, a separation in which the source dries up. In this long paragraph, 456, Hegel begins outlining the dynamics of the family, which are really the dynamics, if we want to call them, of the divine law. The reason I say dynamics here is because Hegel insists at the beginning that what happens when we're examining the divine law, and what we're doing here as phenomenologists is looking at how things in fact do play themselves out, is we find that there are differences or distinctions, Unterschiede, right? And then interrelationships, Beziehung, between the different people involved in the family, the different members of the family. And Hegel says that this is what provides it with a living process of actuality. This is a point that's worth dwelling on. When we theorize about the family, we often do so in a rather static way, as if we're taking a snapshot of how things are set out. And we forget that the family itself is an organization that exists in time. And it exists in time in two very important ways. It exists in time in the way that other things do, where there's cycles, and there's ups and downs, and of course there's changes that are going to occur. And then we can think about it in terms of momentous changes that are passing something on. So when Hegel, for example, a little bit later is going to talk about generations and what's happening between husband and wife becoming parents and then children, and then this going on and on and on, he is talking about that sort of temporality. We often tend to forget about that, and we think in terms of the past, like my ancestors, my great-great-grandfather, and we forget that at one time they were siblings or children or new parents, and that gets kind of lost in the picture. Hegel's trying to restore that here for a given purpose, to parse out what the divine law is. So he says, among the three relationships, the ones that he's going to talk about here, husband and wife, parents and children, brothers and sisters, why is he focusing on those? Well, the last one is the really interesting choice, and he's actually not going to talk about that much in this paragraph, but in the paragraphs yet to come. But think about traditional theorizing from a social perspective or an ethical perspective about the family. You might think, for example, about what goes on in Plato's works, or particularly in Aristotle's discussions, or in later discussions. So the husband and wife, man and woman, come together. As Aristotle says, we are pairing creatures even more than we are political creatures. Right? There's a natural instinct, as we'll talk about in just a moment, but something more happens. In a way, this is taking us a little far afield, but it reminds me of something that somebody who drew quite a bit from Hegel, but also was very interested in applying it within a psychoanalytic perspective. Jacques Lacan points out something that he's not the originator of, but he really drives it home, which is that because we find ourselves drawn into relationships with the other, we often get into them before we have any idea of what exactly we're doing. And we have to kind of figure it out as we go along, while these powerful motives are driving us that we don't fully understand, and culture is telling us contradictory messages. And, oftentimes, older people look back and say, oh, I wish I would have known in my 20s what I now know in my 40s, in my 60s, about relationships, or that sort of thing. And so there's an interesting thing going on here with the relationship in the formation of the family. At least, the traditional family as we're thinking about it. Now, he says, among these relationships, husband and wife, parents and children, brothers and sisters, the relationship of husband and wife, he's going to talk about that one first, he says, is in the first place the one in which consciousness immediately recognizes itself in another. So this is a very important point. One of the things that we saw come up as key, not just in that particular phase, but as part of human nature, is this desire, this hunger for recognition from the other, which also allows us to have recognition of ourselves. We saw this come up in the self-consciousness section, and back then it led to a struggle to the death and the master-slave dialectic. We're actually past that in this point. So don't read the master-slave dialectic into this. That would actually be a terrible mistake. Not only from Hegel's perspective, but also from somebody who he's kind of following along, Aristotle's perspective, right? Aristotle faults in Politics Book 1 the barbarians, that is the non-Greeks, for not realizing that women and slaves are two different, distinct relations, right? Or types of people. That you could, of course, have women and men who are slaves, but you shouldn't treat women within the context of the domestic relationship as slaves. And if you do, you're an idiot. And that's why he says the barbarian men themselves are naturally slavish. There's when everything is reduced to power dynamics of the sort between master and slave, despotes, the word we get despotism from, and doulos, or doula, or doulé rather, then we're effacing the distinctively human in many respects, and certainly effacing what ought to be going on within the family. So Hegel says, this is a place where recognition can take place between the woman and the man. Now, the recognition takes place in part because of their roles here. Identifying no longer merely as woman and man, or male and female, but as wife and husband, as existing in a relationship with each other. So he goes on and he says, not only does one consciousness immediately recognize itself in another, there is knowledge of this mutual recognition. There's a little bit of a play on words here. Erkennen of anerkennen. So this is quite important. Now he says, because this self-recognition is a natural and not an ethical one, it is only a representation, an image of spirit, not actually spirit itself. And you might say, oh, well, that's too bad. Well, an image is still better than nothing, isn't it? And it can lead us to spirit. So there's something going on here that is really quite important that is developing within the divine law. Hegel goes on and he says, a representation or an image has its actual existence in something other than itself. So what is that? What is the thing in which it has its existence? It's not the society that grants these roles, husband, wife, and says, all right, do these things, right? No, it's going to be in something else that happens within the household. Put men and women together in natural circumstances that have been occurring throughout the history of our species, and let the drives for sex, whatever we think they're rooted in, whether we think it's rooted in pleasure or reproduction or intimacy or some other thing, framed in terms of the good, what is the product of that? I mean, pleasure is a product of that, hopefully. Children. You produce new human beings. And so he goes on and he says, this representation has its actual existence in something other than itself. This relationship has its actual existence not in itself, but in the child, an other. So we have a relationship between two others, male and female, husband and wife, who are recognizing each other, hopefully, within the relationship, and they produce another other, an other who is, in relation to them, more other than either one of them. I mean, if you've ever been a first-time parent, you know just how other that little lump of crying, needy flesh that we call babies actually is. And then, this goes on for a while. You want to see sort of the whole range between beautiful, interested, curious, self-giving, and like the worst forms of egoism available at that point in time. Have a child, have a toddler, right? And ask them about things. So there's a new thing on the scene here. An other who's coming into existence is the relationship, he says, and also is that in which the relationship itself gradually passes away. Having a child changes the structure of a marriage. Having a second child changes it yet more. I'm not saying it's just in terms of, for example, sexuality and, the common parent complaint that, now once you have kids, you don't really get time. I mean, you don't really, if you have kids and you take your parenting seriously, you find yourself without time and energy for all sorts of things. Sex is actually sort of down on the list. You may not have the energy and time to do all sorts of other things that you probably would spend more time on if you could. And then, all the things about mutual pleasure can take place much later. Now, that's not to say that all the caricatures of marriage and child rearing are actually true on this, but there is a transformation that takes place within a healthy family. And particularly once you have more kids, once you have children rather than just a child. So Hegel goes on and he says, this alternation of successive generations has its enduring basis in the nation. And he just suggests that there. He's not going to follow up on that. But this notion of generation following generation, here is where the culture, the overarching culture, does play a role. And we might say that family has really got it together, and that family over there is dysfunctional. And we do that not just from the basis of our own family, but within a larger social matrix. Now, going on, Hegel will tell us here that the reverence of husband and wife towards each other is mixed in with two things. With what he calls a natural relation, that is sexual desire, right? And with feeling, Gefühl. Feeling is not a bad thing for Hegel, but feeling is always lower than Vorstellung, representation, which is always lower than conceptual thinking, Begriff, right? So what is happening here is not entirely ethical, in part because it is mixed in with, just natural instincts and feelings and desires along those lines. So he says the return into itself of the relationship does not take place in the relationship itself. So whatever dynamic of recognition is happening, husband and wife have it, but they're also trying to have it through the children, but they're not actually going to get it. And there's kind of a tragic situation that, again, has to do with generations here. So he says there's a two-part relationship in parents and children. It's asymmetrical, right? The attitude of parents towards their children, he says, is emotionally affected by the fact that the objective reality of the relationship does not exist in them, that is, in the husband and wife, but in the children. The children are the product of their relationship. The children are the sign that the relationship has strength. And you might say, oh, what about a childless marriage then? Does that mean that it's no good whatsoever? Well, we might think of other things that work as surrogates, but those surrogates themselves are not going to be possessed of a subjectivity. So if you indeed have your marriage and what you're going to do is you buy a boat and you go boating all the time and you really spend a lot of time polishing it. Yeah, you can say her about the boat as we do, but that boat is not a person. What else could be similar? Well, you could have a spiritual connection producing works that have a genuine subjectivity to them together. We might talk about adoption. Hegel doesn't worry about that at this point. He's doing something a bit simpler. But he is pointing out that the relationship with the parents really is mediated through the children. So he says, by their witnessing the development of the children of an independent existence which they're unable to take back again. So parents get together, driven together, have a relationship. Children are the product of it. The meaning of their relationship, in large part, turns to be now one involving the children. And once you've given it out, like Hegel's saying, you can't get it back again. Children are like weed gardens. You never know what the hell is going to come up with them. You can read your baby books and buy all of your fancy preps to have them listen to classical music in the womb, and then send them to the right little schools and police their behavior so they're not getting these ideas and they are getting these ideas, and people do go wild with this sort of stuff in our culture, right? Which is basically a sign that those people have way too much time on their hands and have never really worked through their own worries about their own relationship to the ethical, or they wouldn't be putting so much stuff on their kids, which often makes them quite neurotic. But the kids can turn out totally different than what you want. It's not to say that if you model certain behavior, your kids aren't going to pick that up. But all of the things that we've looked at in the past having to do with sort of formation by determinants, and then what it is that a free subjectivity is able to do in adopting some of those and in reinterpreting them, this applies to children and the process of maturation. Every generation finds out that the next generation coming after it didn't do things according to plan. On the other side, he says that of children towards parents is emotionally affected, conversely by the fact that they derive their existence from or have their essential being in what is other than themselves. Nobody is a self-made person, and we all realize that we come from somebody else, and it's contingent. And it's contingent in a certain respect, right? Because I could have been born from other people. My parents didn't necessarily have to get together any more than yours did. There's no overarching necessity running the whole universe that made it so that this person had to be in this place at this time. We can talk about causes, but there's nothing with a capital N necessity, right? And yet, There isn't anyone else who would have been my parents, because it wouldn't have been me in that case, right? So there's a contingency and necessity paradox here as well. And he says they derive their existence from and have their essential being in what is other than themselves and passes away. Their parents pass away. And by their attaining independence and a self-consciousness of their own, only by being separated from their source, a separation in which the source dries up. This is the other side of the equation. In order to attain independence, you do, in fact, on some level, have to break with mom and dad and become your own person and make your own choices. And it could turn out that you wind up just like mom or dad, but in a certain respect, that's because part of you has taken that on and decided for that. And it could have been very different. So that's where Hegel ends. Notice what he hasn't talked about here, brother and sister. That comes in the next paragraph. Both these relationships are confined within the transition and the disparity of the sides which are assigned to them. The relationship in its unmixed form is found, however, in that between brother and sister. They are the same blood, which has, however, in them reached a state of rest and equilibrium. Therefore they do not desire one another, nor have they given to or received from one another this independent being for self. On the contrary, they are free individualities in regard to each other. Consequently, the feminine in the form of the sister has the highest intuitive awareness of what is ethical. She does not attain to consciousness of it or to the objective existence of it, because the law of the family is an implicit inner essence which is not exposed to the daylight of consciousness, but remains an inner feeling and the divine element that is exempt from an existence in the real world. The woman is associated with these household gods, penates, and beholds in them both her universal substance and her particular individuality. Yet, in such a way that this relationship of her individuality to them is at the same time not the natural one of desire. As a daughter, the woman must now see her parents pass away with a natural emotion and ethical resignation, for it is only at the cost of this relationship that she can achieve that existence of her own of which she is capable. Thus, in the parents, she does not behold her own being for self in a positive form. The relationships of mother and wife, however, are those of particular individuals, partly in the form of something natural pertaining to desire, partly in the form of something negative, which sees in those relationships only something evanescent, and also, again, the particular individual is, for that very reason, a contingent element which can be replaced by another individual. In the ethical household, it is not a question of this particular husband, this particular child, but simply of husband and children generally. The relationships of the woman are based not on feeling, but on the universal. The difference between the ethical life of the woman and that of the man consists just in this, that in her vocation as an individual and in her pleasure, her interest is centered on the universal and remains alien to the particularity of desire. Whereas in the husband, these two sides are separated. And since he possesses as a citizen the self-conscious power of universality, he thereby acquires the right of desire and at the same time preserves his freedom in regard to it. Since then, in this relationship of the wife, there is an admixture of particularity. Her ethical life is not pure. But insofar as it is ethical, the particularity is a matter of indifference, and the wife is without the moment of knowing herself as this particular self in the other partner. The brother, however, is for the sister a passive, similar being in general. The recognition of herself in him is pure and unmixed with any natural desire. In this relationship, therefore, the indifference of the particularity and the ethical contingency of the latter are not present, but the moment of the individual self recognizing and being recognized can here assert its right, because it is linked to the equilibrium of the blood and is a relation devoid of desire. The loss of the brother is therefore irreparable to the sister, and her duty towards him is the highest. Here in paragraph 457, Hegel is going to now sketch out the third relationship within the family, the dynamic of the law of the family or the divine law, and that is the relationship between sister and brother. There's a few things to keep in mind as we work through this longish paragraph. One is that in the back of his mind the entire time, Hegel has the figure of Antigone from the Greek play in his mind. You're going to see this at the very end where he's talking about the loss of the brother and what has to be done in relationship to the brother. The other thing to keep in mind is that Hegel is not one bit whatsoever denying the fact that there sometimes is desire between brother and sister, and indeed sometimes the transgression of the incest ban. But what he's talking about here is sort of the relationship as he conceives of it as normally functioning, and even as ideally functioning in somebody like Antigone. So he goes on and he says, the two relationships that we looked at before, husband to wife, parent to child, are confined within the transition and disparity of the sides which are assigned to them. Then he says the relationship in its unmixed form is found in that between brother and sister. They are the same blood, which has, however, in them, as he says, reached a state of rest, ruhe, and equilibrium. So they don't desire each other. They don't have the type of desire that on the one hand husband and wife have for each other, nor do they have the type of desire that characterizes essentially like a desire for more being between parent to child and child to parent. So he goes on and he says, they don't desire each other, nor have they given to or received from one another this independent being for self. On the contrary, they're freed up. They are free individualities in regard to each other. You could say that there aren't the kind of family dynamic metaphysical stakes that are found in these other two relationships for the brother and sister. And now you might pause and say, Hegel, why is it brother and sister? Why isn't it brother and brother or just sibling and sibling? And Hegel has got his reasons for that, some of which are going to come clear in other paragraphs. But between brother and sister, there's a greater degree of difference, at least, because there's sexual difference, I suppose, is the easiest way to put it. And this comes from having different roles. So he says, now, of course, Hegel here is, a little bit rooted in his culture and, going back to ancient culture where there's this very essentialist view on gender or sexuality. So he's going to talk about the woman, existing in this way. But let's follow along with what he says. So he tells us that the feminine, in the form of the sister, has the highest intuitive awareness of what is ethical, but she does not attain to consciousness of it or to the objective existence of it. Why? Is it because she's a woman? No. Because the law of the family, Hegel says, is an implicit inner essence which is not exposed to the daylight of consciousness, but remains an inner feeling and a divine element exempt from an existence in the real world. We've already talked about this in the previous paragraphs. This is something that is characteristic both of the family and of the divine law, that it somehow eludes, evades, escapes the totality of the ethical community, the folk, the Staat, the people, the state. Now it's being looked at as something that belongs peculiarly to the sister. Why? So this has to do with the traditional assignation of gender roles. Not only the sister, but also the wife, in, say, traditional Greek, Roman, later on Western culture, tended to keep women confined in the home, the domestic setting, right? I mean, we already see somebody like Wollstonecraft a little bit before Hegel, saying this is precisely the problem, right? You've decided to assign to one sex the fact that they have to take care of the home, and the best you're going to provide them in terms of education is not a public education, but a domestic education. The men, of course, get to go out and belong to the wider culture, participate in commerce, participate more fully in intellectual life, participate in politics, right? And that's what the brother is going to get to do more of. So Hegel talks here in terms of the woman being associated with these household gods, and Miller substitutes here the penates, right? And the penates were, exactly what we're talking about here. Household gods came from the word for larder or pantry, where you're storing your goods, the penus, and these are not other people's household gods, but those peculiar to your household. And so Hegel says, she beholds in them both her universal substance and her particular individuality, yet in such a way that this relationship of her individuality to them is at the same time not the natural one of desire. There's something, as Hegel's going to say, more universal going on here. And then he talks about the relationship between the daughter and the parents, and how the daughter is attaining to something that's elevated. Again, the ethical. So he says, the woman must see her parents pass away with a natural emotion and ethical resignation. Why? It's only at the cost of this relationship that she can achieve that existence of her own of which she is capable. So this doesn't necessarily have to be the death, too. This can be the replacement of roles, You're within a traditional household, so there's an extended family. The mother gets old. The mother is no longer running the household. The daughter takes over, and now she has a sort of independence and substantiality as an independent being that she was lacking before, but only because her mother has given way. Now, this is actually a big intergenerational problem, isn't it? That oftentimes parents struggle because they don't want to give up that sort of thing. This is becoming more of a pressing problem as life gets extended further and further. There's a lot that could be reflected on about this. So she says, in the parents, she does not behold her own being for self in a positive form. The relationships of mother and wife, which are other options for the sister, right, are, as Hegel says, those of particular individuals, partly in the form of something natural pertaining to desire, wife, right, partly in the form of something negative, which sees in these relationships only something evanescent. And again, the particular individual is for that very reason a contingent element which can be replaced by another individual. That's a very interesting suggestion, isn't it? Well, you can replace one person with another person. Where, then, are we going to have the person, the sister, being treated as an independent being? So here's where Hegel says something really interesting. And when we read this, we might say, I don't know if I want that kind of household. He talks about the ethical household. It's not a question of this particular husband, this particular child, but simply of husband and children generally. The relationships of the woman are based not on feeling, but the universal. So somebody would say, for example, let's take the mother aspect, right? Now, there's a natural affection generally that parents feel towards their children. We talk about this today, not only in terms of affection, but attachment and all sorts of other interesting psychological phenomena. And Hegel is saying that's all nice, that's all particular and contingent. When you have an ethical relationship with your child, you have a certain comportment to your child, not as that little Johnny or Jenny or whatever, but as a child per se. Now, this sounds very impersonal, doesn't it? And so we might say, I'm not sure I really like that idea within the family. Hegel's going somewhere with this, though. He says, the difference between the ethical life of the woman and the man consists in this. In her vocation as an individual, And in her pleasure, her interest is centered on the universal and remains alien to the particularity of desire. So there's a bifurcation between pleasure and desire, contingent, particular, and the universal, the ethical over here, within which there's a greater, deeper satisfaction. In the husband, he says, the two sides are separated. Why is this? Because the husband goes out into the larger social world. He possesses, as a citizen, the self-conscious power of universality. He thereby acquires the right of desire and at the same time preserves his freedom in relation to it. So he goes on and he says, since in this relationship with the wife there's an admixture of particularity, her ethical life is not pure. But insofar as it's ethical, the particularity becomes a matter of indifference, and the wife is without the moment of knowing herself as this particular self in the other partner. So Hegel is identifying a problem here rather than sketching out how it ought to be. He's saying precisely because the wife is confined to the domestic sphere and then has the husband, the male correlative, who himself is able to do these things, she's either going to be related to him in terms of particularity, that is through love, pleasure, desire, all of these feelings, or perhaps jealousy or negative feelings as well. Or she's going to be related to him through the ethical, in which case she is not going to have her individuality as a particular individual a component of that. She'll be treating herself as a kind of universal person, and there's going to be something not missing, but what would be viewed as missing is stuck on the other side, you might say. Now, why is the relationship with the brother different than this? Hegel says that the brother is for the sister a passive, similar being in general. The recognition of herself in him is pure and unmixed with any natural desire. There's no stakes of, parent and children or husband and wife or any of those sorts of things. She's able to have a more, you might say, more free and objective relationship with him as an individual person, in which case they're both able to be recognized. They're able to provide each other with that anerkennen that Hegel says that we're all desiring. And that's precisely because he's not a husband, not a father. Definitely not her husband, not her father, not her child either, we should probably put in there. He could be somebody else's husband and father, and this leads to other dynamics. But he goes on and he says, so in this relationship, the indifference of the particularity and the ethical contingency of the latter, they're not present. They're able to be fully ethical with each other. The moment of the individual self recognizing and being recognized can here assert its right, because it's linked to the equilibrium of the blood and is a relation devoid of desire. The loss of the brother, here's where we're going to get to Antigone, is therefore irreparable to the sister, and her duty towards him is the highest. Why is it the highest? Because in the relationship to the living brother, both of them enjoy what it is that Hegel says that we're really fundamentally after as self-consciousnesses, which is recognition, mutual recognition. Recognition of the other by ourself, and recognition of ourself by the other, and thereby recognition of ourself, through the other by ourself, and vice versa. So the loss of that is a greater loss, according to Hegel, than the loss of a parent or even the loss of a child.